Okay, good morning everyone, and thanks for this bright and early start, and thanks for joining us today as we look to get back into a discussion we had back in September around KPIs and problem gambling. And for those who attended our first round of discussions, welcome back. And for those just joining for the first time, then welcome, and I hope everybody's safe and well wherever you may be. So just quick recap, back in September, I was delighted to moderate the panel looking at KPIs. So the key performance indicators that are going to be so important, both for those affected by the gambling sector, as well as the industry's reputation and credibility as we look to build trust and sustainability. No one needs reminding, I guess, of the focus the sector has in the eyes of the media, the politicians, and more critically, the public. So it's critical that the industry's efforts and harm minimisation initiatives are evidence-based and outcome-based. And that is why measurable and accountable KPIs are going to be so important as we sort of re-establish or try to re-establish the trust for the sector. And I've done a few panels over the sort of 10, 12 years I've been in the sector, but this one really seemed to grab the imagination, which is why we're sort of all back together and going back through it again. Maybe it's because the fact that it was never really discussed KPIs previously, or the subject was both novel and timely. With those ongoing conversations around harm minimisation. But I also think it was down to the breadth of the panel, so everything from a regulator to an operator, a trade association, and a treatment clinic. But this time around, we've added to the scope by making sure that the research and academic community is included, because ultimately, whichever way we go on this, it has to be evidence-based. And we need to know how we benchmark our efforts to judge success, and that will only be done by research. So what are our KPIs for the session today? Well, we want to achieve out of it. Well, firstly, we want to replicate the interesting debate we had, but we want to delve a bit deeper into the areas we discussed and look at some of the very specific measures that can be taken. But we need your input for this as well. So there's a Q&A function in there, and there's a chat function. So please have some input, get involved with us, help us guide that debate as we go forward. So we're going to make it 40 minutes, try to keep it short and sharp. There's going to be Q&A at the end if we've got any questions, and we'll all be done and dusted, hopefully back at our desks and our laptop within 45 minutes. So before we get into detail, I'm going to ask the panellists to introduce themselves, and I'll start with the new member of the team, and that's Sally Gainsbury. Sally, would you like to tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Thanks very much, Peter. I'm Sally Gainsbury. I am Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney and Associate Professor in the School of Psychology. I also lead a team within the Brain and Mind Centre called the Technology Addiction Team. So you can probably imagine that my research focuses on how we can use the nexus of research and treatment to minimise gambling-related harm. And I have a particular interest in how technology is impacting gambling and how we can utilise technology to minimise harms related to gambling. So I'm very excited to hear about all of the initiatives and how we can change some of the risk factors of particularly online, but as well as land-based gambling that new technology might bring, and really harness these to make it a very protected and safe environment so that customers can engage in the products but without unnecessary risks.
No, that's great. And I think bringing that sort of background to it is going to help some guidance for the panel as we go through today. Matthew, can I come to you next? Do you want to tell us a bit about you and the critical work you and your team do?
Yeah, so my name's Matthew Hickey. I am Chief Executive of Gordon Moody. Gordon Moody deliver a range of services, but predominantly we deliver residential treatment services in the UK for those that are the most affected by their gambling addictions. Over the last 6 months in particular, we've seen a great growth of interest in the organisation with younger people and from females, but also, you know, consistent with the males as well.
No, I think it's really great to get that view of those most affected, and we'll come to that as we're going through the debate. Yannicka, I'll come to yourself next. Tell us a bit about yourself, please.
Hi, I'm happy to be back with this panel. It was admittedly one of my most interesting panels I've been on, even though it's been a series of virtual sessions over this post-COVID period. I work within the International Affairs and Policy Department of the Malta Gaming Authority, which is the regulator that licenses and regulates all online and land-based gambling that happens in and from Malta. And in my role, I both look at what is happening internationally in order to be able to see how to be able to collaborate and how to implement other best practices in our regulation, and as well as obviously policy initiatives. So horizon scanning, seeing what's new. And lately, our focus has been predominantly on making sure that the gambling is safe for consumer, and by extension, it is sustainable. It is in our interest, both as a country and as a people, and to protect consumers and to make sure it is a sustainable industry too.
Yeah, and I think that's very true. I think gone are the days of just onboarding customers. Everybody realises the most important asset a business has, so how we engage and protect them is critical. Sandy, I'll come to you next as the operator on the panel. Do you want to tell us a bit about yourselves?
Sure. Hi all, I'm Sandhya Singh. I lead the risk and fraud payments and customer service teams for Napoleon Sports and Casino. So we are a Belgian-based operator who has 2 land-based casinos, 27 arcades, and an online casino. So I'm part of the online team, and I'm always curious to find out, how to keep a perfect balance between business and consumer protection, since consumer protection is the heart of our industry. So it's quite interesting to see what industry is doing on this front, and as an operator, how we are contributing and how other operators are looking at this particular perspective.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's seeing how it works in reality as we delve into some of the specifics. And I know you guys have been at the forefront of pushing some of those forward. So finally, for the panel today, I'd come to Peter. Paul, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, Peter?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Peter. Thanks, SBC, and thanks, W2, for hosting this important panel again. My name is Peter Paul de Goey. I'm the Managing Director of the Netherlands Online Gambling Association, the trade association for online gambling operators that want to become active in the Netherlands as soon as the market opens, hopefully, let's say, the second half of next year. I'm delighted to be on this panel again today, because I think this subject is really, really important. It's really dear to us, and we suffer from a lack of information in the online gambling market to base our policy on. So I think this should become a tradition for the future.
Yeah, I think certainly delving into what those KPIs are and how they're being measured is going to be critical. So, yeah, my name's Peter Murray. If you haven't come across me before, I lead the team here at W2, and we're a technology provider that provides real-time compliance solutions, but mainly trying to simplify the management of compliance and the supply chain. But it takes into all these aspects that we're going to talk through today. But what I want to start off with is the research angle of it. So, if I can come to Sally first, this is clearly your area of expertise, and whilst I know what you do is predominantly Australian-based, when we spoke in September, you thought KPIs was an area that really hadn't been focused on before. What's your views on KPIs, and how have you seen it through the research angle?
Thanks, Peter. Yes, I have done research in Australia, although also work with UK as well and international companies and governments. From my point of view, looking at responsible gambling, although I prefer the term consumer protection, particularly when it's customer facing, there's a couple of different angles, and often they get muddled together. So I want to make the distinction between tools or measures that are intended to prevent or minimise gambling-related harm. And in these cases, things like deposit limits and activity statements, I view these as fundamental for all who engage in gambling, similarly to putting on a seatbelt or placing a credit card limit or a limit on your mobile phone or cell phone bill, just so you're aware of what you're doing within boundaries. Some other tools, more restrictive tools like timeouts or self-exclusions, are really more suitable for those people who are having difficulty controlling their gambling. So the aims of these might be quite different in terms of who the target audience are. I've been conducting research with wagering operators and online gambling operators, most recently a study with 6 operators across Australia, where we looked at de-identified data from about 32,000 customers. So we were looking specifically to identify what are the risk indicators of harm, and how can we send messages and encourage people to set deposit limits with that KPI deposit limits being appropriate for everybody, and then looking at the change in behaviour. So I really think that conducting research, working with independent researchers, operators and regulators can learn a lot about how to inform regulatory requirements and compliance standards by having a greater understanding of what are the risk indicators and who are the appropriate target populations. And then fundamentally, how do we customise consumer protection strategies, because it's just not appropriate that we would expect that the same strategies would be relevant and the same messages to use these would be relevant across the entire consumer cohort.
So I think if you take away from that, the sort of two ways of looking at it, the sort of the general KPIs and the very bespoke and specific. So is it a case of with the little sort of research in that, you start generally and then get a bit more specific depending on the jurisdiction or the games that are being played?
Certainly, we are very much at the starting blocks when it comes to having a good understanding. So, for example, our initial research would look at generalised messages, and then we would look to get more customised. And as we go, evaluate and test until we do have a better bespoke solution, recognising the difference between different cohorts based on their demographics and game preferences, based on their risk indicators, and ideally getting something that is quite specific to each jurisdiction and operator based on the maximum uptake of consumer protection tools amongst the target population.
Okay, good stuff. I'll come to the rest of the panel now around that sort of general versus specific angle. Yannick, I'll come to yourself from a regulator's perspective. What's generally around KPIs and what you've seen from the Malta Gaming Authority? What's your views on generally around the more general view as well as the specific KPIs we might be using?
So as a legislator in Malta, we have taken the approach of objective-based legislation. So it's more general in that sense, and it is more results-focused. So when we are conducting our responsible gambling audits, which are very specific audits, which we have just started this year, which are aimed specifically at seeing what is going on with the responsible gambling measures that are being adopted by operators. So the general checks were always included within our compliance audits, but now we are conducting specific RG audits. And in these audits, what we do is we get a selection of players and we evaluate the entire relationship that the player has had with that operator. And by doing so, we are able to see the results of the measures that operators are supposed to be implementing. We are not necessarily evaluating the measure itself, but we are seeing the result. The reason for this is that there's plenty of different technological ideas and measures that can achieve good results. We are not about to limit, we are not in the business of limiting the technological innovation. If there's better technology for it, then so be it. But we do view the result itself, and we do assess whether or not it is working in the way it should be working. And so it's a more general approach in that sense. We do not have any, even the restrictions are not specific. And there is a policy reason for this. We do not have specific restrictions for the reason that we believe that there is no one size fits all for all consumers. And we would not like to be in a position where the regulated market is less attractive than the unregulated and dangerous black market. So there is a reason for this, and that is it, basically.
Okay. Now, it is interesting if we go through what you would have in the audit, but I think the one-size-fits-all debate's an interesting one. Actually, Peter Paul, I'll come to you next from the Netherlands perspective. Does that, I'm assuming we on the panel sort of agree around the sort of general KPIs, but the one-size-fits-all, how do you see that?
No, I don't believe that one size fits all. Of course, there has to be, let's say, a generic set of KPIs, but then in an ideal world, you should work towards having specific KPIs that are tailor-made to certain types of players. But you should start, of course, with generic KPIs. That's the way to go.
Yeah, I think so, and especially from Sally's perspective, if there's not that much research there, that's probably where we need to start. Sandhya, from an operator's perspective, and maybe from the market in in Belgium, and we'll come to some specifics a bit later. How have you been looking at KPIs? Have you kept them generic to this point, or are you getting a bit more specific with what you're implementing?
Yeah, so from a Belgium perspective, so some of the measures that we have in place are already very much regulated and already very clear. For example, we have no bonuses that can be offered, no usage of credit cards, no advertising before 8 p.m. So these are already very strict measures that are in place. So from a KPI perspective, as a company, we definitely look at the number of people who have self-excluded. So we have player deposit limits. So we also look at how many people have reduced their player deposit limits, what is the decrease, and what are the number of decreases that we are seeing. Plus, we also look at communications that have been irresponsible gaming communications that have been sent to the customers. So definitely we are looking at more KPIs. So these are the basic ones we are looking at. But we are also on the verge of implementing an external tool which will provide us analytics on responsible gaming based on all number of factors like how much time a player has spent, what is the deposit limit, how many times they've increased. So we will be having a more analytical approach and a tailored communication towards the customers.
And I think that's a point. Valid data is going to be key as we're trying to get stuff that works across the sector. Thanks for that. Matthew, from your perspective, I guess from the treatment clinic point of view, you are dealing with those at the end of the spectrum where they've gone through most of this. Do you think KPIs are useful, or that debate around a generalized or a bespoke? What do you, the people who come to you tell you in this aspect?
I think from our point of view, the mass population which engage with gambling and gaming do so in a safe way. They undertake their gaming, their gambling, and do so for fun, and they're able to control things. I think putting some parameters around that general population is a really good thing. I think for those people that are at the extreme level that we treat, those with the most addictive personalities, whatever we put in place, they are going to get their fix, for want of a better phrase. And, gambling addicts in particular are the most manipulative people you'll ever meet because of the web of lies and deceit that they've had to put in place to get what they need. So I think for the mass population, KPIs are a really strong thing. But for those that are the most at risk, then, we need to treat them differently. So I would agree with everything that Sally had said right at the beginning. We have to start somewhere and we have to protect the mass population. But there will always be those that come out of this the other side who are still problem gamblers to the extreme.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lot within the industry around how we address the size of problem gambling generally, but also how we can identify markers of harm in the lead-up. But I absolutely get your point that those who are determined to do so will. I just hope some people outside of the sector that get the same message. I think we wanted to look at some of the very specifics around this, and I think there's two areas we could probably use as a benchmark for doing that. One of those is Germany, because it's fairly high profile, and some of the limits that we've been putting in there have been eye-catching. The other one is Belgium, and we bring that up because we were in a debate yesterday around what Belgium's trying to introduce. So when you put limits into this, what that actually means. So, Sanjay, as you're the one who's sort of front and centre in dealing with the regulation that's coming, we were talking about limiting weekly deposits. Can you just give us a flavour of what Belgium's trying to introduce and how you guys are going to be involved with it?
Sure. So basically, the Belgium Gaming Commission has introduced a system, or would be introducing a system, which is still in test phase, to identify and to work with the National Bank of Belgium and identify if a player is eligible for a increase, for a PDL increase, deposit limit increase. So for every player request, the weekly deposits that we have, so if a player wants to increase his deposit limit further, it will be an API call with the Gaming Commission, who would further get a response as accepted or rejected from the National Bank of Belgium. The entire idea of doing this is to ensure that players who have debt issues or who have outstanding debts with the banks are reviewed and are not given a limit increase, because it will only further harm their financial status. So I think it's a first of its kind. It looks quite promising, but it's still in its test phase. So we are one of the operators who will be testing it along with other operators, but still more to know whether, or more clarity is still required on how the system will, whether the system will replace the 72-hour cooldown period that we have currently, and the GDPR regulations. So far we will not deal with players' personal data. We will only we are expected to get only a received or an accepted or a rejected request. So still more things to explore, but it sounds quite exciting and in the right direction so far.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating on a whole host of levels. I'm not quite sure where to start with it, but in essence, I believe, so somebody wants to increase their deposit limit from, say, 500 euros. They effectively then have to go through a check that goes off to the Belgian National Bank. They then they check somehow their payment and debt issues, and they come back with a simple yes or no. Is that how that seems to be working?
Yes, that's how it appears for now. But once we get to really test the system and understand it more, we'll have more clarity on the entire process.
Okay, well, as I say, more questions and answers. It's fascinating. So let's go around the panel and see, just as a basic idea of what we think. Sally, I'll come to you first. Those deposit limits of putting in something and then barriers in the way of increasing that. Research point of view and from the work you've done, do you see that as a beneficial way? Is it good? Does it work?
So deposit limits are very positive. In our last study, as I mentioned, we looked at 32,000 customers across 6 different operators. We found significant differences amongst those customers who voluntarily set a deposit limit in response to receiving a message. And the messages deliberately reduced the friction required to set a message. So you use behavioural economic principles to make that as easy as possible, replicating research found in the UK. And we found that the customers who did set a deposit limit had significantly lower risk markers for gambling-related harm. So that is obviously a research-based positive. They still continue to be customers, so they didn't switch their gambling to another site or reduce gambling completely, but they had lower markers of risk harm in things like very high deposits or frequency of betting. They lowered how much they were betting. They were a bit more stable. So that's a really positive indicator that suggests that deposit limits are very useful. I think it's an interesting question, and from a research point of view, I'm very curious about how it can work with involving financial institutions, and certainly there's been a push towards financial institutions being more involved and taking greater responsibility for gambling-related harm, giving their unique insights into what wagering operators can't necessarily tell, which is how affordable someone's gambling is. That's information that financial institutions can add to the equation. So I'm very interested to follow and see what happens. One thing we do have to be mindful of is that there are restrictions, being mindful of the negative unintended consequences of pushing people off a safe site by overly restricting them and pushing them onto sites that have fewer restrictions and are at greater risk of harm. So we've got to balance those two requirements.
No, I think the UK have put something out in the last week around the financial services sector getting involved and helping support around that. But that area of affordability and the certain sections in, say, the UK that would call that the nanny state and people trying to tell them what to do. But it's interesting that when limits are put in, it does seem to have a positive effect or at least help in that process. Janneke, from a regulator's perspective, because ultimately this putting in what the Belgian regulator's talking around is going to be led by you. From a deposit limit perspective, what's the MGA's view on setting those limits?
Yep. So in 2018, we had our second wave of legislation, and in that wave of legislation, so in the Player Protection Directive of 2018, it became mandatory for operators to tell players to set a deposit limit immediately upon registration or immediately upon first login. So players must set a voluntary deposit limit. What the law doesn't do in Malta is tell players what the deposit limit is supposed to be. So it is a voluntary limit. And we have based this off our own research because we got Professor Mark Griffiths, I think he's very well known in this industry, to review the new law and to tell us what could be changed and what could be improved in order to have a more comprehensive protective framework. And what his research showed was that as long as the limit is voluntary and it is the player who is setting that limit, the player is more likely to show a positive effect and less likely to develop a gambling problem if the limit was voluntary rather than if the limit was imposed on that player. So far, we have based our approach towards player protection on this research. And so the limit is set by the player. Of course, however, if that player starts showing signs of a gambling problem, then it is the operator's duty, also under the same law, to set either a more restrictive deposit or to block that player himself. But so far, we believe in voluntary deposit limits.
Yeah, okay. It'll be interesting to see how that research pans out. I think it's recognised that deposit limits work. It's how you get people to engage with it. Peter Paul, I'll come to you in the Dutch market for now. What are we seeing coming in from the regulator and from your operators specifically around deposit limits?
So the upcoming law and regulations that will come into force per the 1st of March 2021 do require operators to offer players to set a limit. So it's required to have that functionality in your platform. I don't think we're going as far as Belgium is going. It's going to be interesting to see how they objectively will decide on what is affordable and what is not. It seems like a Pandora's box. But if you want to have an idea of a limit that seems to be working, I was struck by what PAF did. The casino operator from those islands next to Sweden and Finland, I think, and they began setting limits. They called it total loss limit, and they've most recently in September lowered the total loss limit to 20,000 per annum. So it seems that loss limits or stake limits are working. But again, it will be a balancing act not to drive customers away to the unregulated offer, because that will obviously not be in the interest of consumers, because they're not protected with the offer. So it's going to be interesting to see how that develops in the Netherlands. And I know that my members, at least, are very willing and keen to see what system will work and what will protect consumers and keep them with the regulated offer.
Yeah, I think driving players away into the unregulated markets is a key issue. It's not one for the debate today. We can do that another time. We'll stick to the specifics of what we got. But I think you're absolutely right. It's regulators, and the challenge the likes of Yannicka have is if they get it wrong, then people don't have any protection as they go elsewhere. Just quickly before we move on, Sally, is there any research between voluntary deposit limits and mandatory deposit limits, and if they make any difference?
There is, but unfortunately, they're not at the same time. So we have research, for example, from Norway looking at mandatory deposit limits, and we have research from other jurisdictions looking at voluntary deposit limits. But given the difference between customers, so for example, you're using terms like nanny state in the UK, and in Australia we have similar sort of cultural concepts, whereas other countries have different approaches or different acceptance of these sorts of restrictions being placed on them. So it's really important when we say to look at this research, and it's a pity that we have so few people working in these areas. So it's great that, Mark Griffiths has been involved and my team's involved, but given that the differences between jurisdictions, we can't draw parallels. Briefly, most of the research has been on voluntary limits, mostly because they're the type in place in online gambling. There are relatively few jurisdictions that do have mandatory deposit limits. So as was mentioned, it's important that customers do feel empowered, and certainly that positive change comes from the customers changing their own behaviour and being motivated to do so. And the risk of mandatory limits is that they have to be kind of appropriate or a catch-all. So that means that they're often too high for the vast majority of people, but they are too low for people who do want to spend more money. So they're less effective than something that's a bit more customizable.
Yeah. No, and I think that research the likes of Mark and yourselves are doing will give us some guidance in the future. Matthew, I'll come to you now on this one. I think it probably fits in the same category that whatever limits we put on it, whether it's too high or too low or whatever, is always going to be a challenge for those that want to get around it. I'm assuming whatever that limit is, if you're absolutely determined to do it, is not going to work. Is there anything you can see that would work from the people that are determined to get around it?
For those that are determined, not really, no. They create several different personas, several different accounts. They bet across several different organizations, whether that be regulated or unregulated. They, once they're at that point of being fully addicted and at the sharp end of their addiction, they will bet on anything. Yeah. They will bet on how quickly two woodlouse will cross the road, right the way through to the outcome of a game. So they need to get their fix, for want of a better phrase, and therefore, and we're only talking a small percentage here. We're not talking mass numbers, but they are the real issue ones, the ones that cause the biggest damage.
No, I think, and that's how we maybe identify markers form earlier on and do as much as we can. We'll never get 100%, but the challenge, I guess, is around that. Sandhya, the last point on the Belgian one before we look at some of the specifics on Germany. So this is a trial period they're talking about putting this in, and when does that trial period start?
So there is no communication yet on the trial period, but yes, we've got the manual for the test system. So we're going to review the manual and see what's in the manual. So maybe somewhere in 2021 is what I'm expecting, but we are yet to receive more information from the Gaming Commission.
Okay, a quick round, sort of, because it came up on there, and I'll start with that. Just the financial sector getting involved in this, because the UK has asked for guidance on that as well. Do we see, I'll come to Peter Paul first, do we see a real value in the financial services sector getting involved? Is there something they can bring to the table that we might be missing in the gambling sector?
Well, I think the financial institutions, so the banks, they are probably best placed for the overview, because they can see across operator borders, so to speak. I think it would be right if the banks would chip in. I think it's a sheer contrast to what you see happening in some countries where the banks are shying away and are closing accounts of gambling companies that are licensed in that country, such as in Sweden, where the number of banks that are being available for licensed operators to have their accounts on is limited to just a few. I think that's the wrong direction. I think it hurts channelization. I think the banks should step up to the plate here. Yes.
Yeah. I think channelization is an interesting one, or how much of that market will disappear into the unregulated markets, and is the challenge for all regulators. Janneke, from a regulator's perspective, have you, can't remember if you mentioned this earlier, but have you asked for some input from the financial services sector in Malta and generally beyond?
Yeah, we do collaborate with financial services, both in Malta and anywhere in the EU for that matter, because we do not make that distinction. But yes, there is an element of cooperation with them and with all operators in general. I think collaboration and cooperation is the backbone of regulation in Malta, and we say this quite proudly because we really believe in it. It helps get a more comprehensive and effective result, in our opinion.
Yeah, I think the collaboration, cooperation one, there's a question coming from Yvonne, I think, around do we think a European approach to, say, deposit limits and some of these is the way forward? And just make it really quickly, because I think we see this on all the panels. I think the generalised view is that, of course, it would be great, but realistically, the chances of it happening are very slim. Yeah, you deal across those markets and across all regulators. Do you think there's ever going to be, maybe the player protection angle is the one angle that might get everybody together? Are you seeing any conversations around trying to do a standardized, harmonized approach?
You asked me the question?
Yes, sorry, Alec, yeah.
It's okay. There are these conversations that happen among regulators on a frequent basis. I would say getting one technical standard that is mandatory across all regulators and all jurisdictions within the EU is highly unlikely. That's the truth. But there is scope and I think a possibility to have at least a minimum basis of requirements that are acceptable and agreed upon across all jurisdictions. I think it's given, I would say all regulators and all jurisdictions have the same objectives in keeping gambling safe, free from crime, keeping it fair. But then the way that every jurisdiction achieves those objectives and the practices differ. And there are differing opinions on how the best way to achieve those objectives. So I would say it's difficult to have one common standard, but minimum standards are coming together. So there's scope and room for it. I think it will just take some more time. And I think this is where the industry needs to step up itself and lead the way, obviously hand in hand with the regulators, but I think it's time for the industry to lead the way on this one.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Peter, I completely agree. I think this is actually something that the industry needs to, act according to their responsibilities. And the way to go is twofold in this. So one is, I think, working together, like Yannicka said, between regulators. But also trade associations should work together in supporting the efforts to get consumer protection really top priority. So just today we have been breaking the news that we're signing an MOU with the Swedish trade association BOS on consumer protection as well. And the other way to do this, since European harmonization is a long way away, is to work together in the European standardization body, CEN, and they are working on responsible gambling guidelines, if you will, as well. So the trade associations, regulators, and operators could work together across the European Union to get to this. Let's say joint policy.
No, I think it's a great point. I think I think you know me, I have a fairly cynical view on our ability to self-regulate. But when it comes to this area and the inability for regulators to come up with harmonisation, maybe that's where we can add real value. And certainly trade associations and the operators working together to come together with a fairly standard. I appreciate we probably need some very specific ones to jurisdictions, etc. But a fairly standardised approach to it is probably the only way short term we can get any meaningful data out of that. So yeah, I'm going to come into Germany for a second. We'll finish through the last sort of 10, 15 minutes on some of the things Germany.
Peter, do you mind if I add something in at that point?
Of course you can. Fire away.
I think the other bit that we should be looking at is, as you were talking then about the trade associations and the operators, I think there is the third dimension of the treatment sector as well. I think if you start building in the treatment sector, and yes, Gordon Moody are at the sharpest end treating those that are most affected, but there are other organisations out there that treat those that are starting to worry that they may well have an issue. And I think if you add in that third dimension of the treatment sector into that data gathering, you've got a real strong picture of what's really going on over people's trends and where the pinch points are coming from.
No, and apologies if I haven't missed that one off, because I think that whole area of whether it's called experts by experience or the treatment centres have seen, I appreciate sort of by the time to get to your treatment centre, they've probably circumnavigated most of the frictions we can put in the way. But the point being that they understand and have been affected by all of that. So yeah, I think the industry is making small strides in that area. But I think, Sally, just quickly coming back to you on research generally around gamblers, is research being done into, say, the people who've attended treatment clinics, or is it sort of the standard generalised population?
No, absolutely. So, for example, I direct the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, and there are only a handful within the world that do combine research and treatment, so we can really look at both of them. So it is really important to look at the whole spectrum, acknowledging that gambling harm develops over time, over a number of years, typically around at least 5 years between the first problem being experienced and seeking treatment. So where we aim to prevent harms, then we might look at community samples or people who are engaged in gambling, and where we're aiming at something like self-exclusion or a more definitive treatment of someone with a gambling problem, we'd look at a treatment-seeking population. But what we want to do is work backwards so we can identify the people that ended up experiencing harm, look at their algorithms that play a behaviour, their risk markers, so we can reverse engineer how could we have potentially detected that person before they ended up having those severe harms. Because once someone has a very severe gambling problem, obviously that's very entrenched and affected their lives. It would be much better if we can try and identify those harms while they're relatively low and make more moderate behavioural changes, even potentially keeping that person on as a sustainable customer without experiencing those harms to the point they really need to self-exclude.
Okay. So yeah, I think Matthew, I absolutely, and I think there's certain stages everybody will fall into through this process, and I think we need to be, and clearly are, hopefully researching across that. So for the remainder of the session, I just want to look into some specifics around KPIs, and we've spoken about Belgium, and we'll look at some of the Germany ones in a second, basically around limits and etc. But Sandhya, coming from an operator's perspective, do you want to give us some examples of what your company's put in place with regards to limits and KPIs we can be judging, because that gets us the feet on the ground, if you like.
Yeah. So as a company, we definitely have PDLs, which is the player deposit limit. So we have put that in place. Every new player who can register can only register with a €500 deposit limit, and we have a cool down period of 72 hours for now if they want to increase it. Other than that, definitely we have self-exclusion, which we capture and measure specifically to see how many people have self-excluded in our overall database. Plus, we also track responsible gaming communications. And we also check, how many people self-excluded post those responsible gaming communications. But these are just basic for now, is what I personally feel. So that's why we are putting up more measures. Where we'll be looking at the time of play, and also showing real-time messages to players when they are on the website. That's what I mentioned, that we have signed up with an external company, Necton. So Mentor is a tool that we'll be using, which will also display live messages when the player is playing based on the analytics that we get from Mentor. So, for example, if somebody is playing for a long time, we might want to pop up a message saying that, hey, we see that you've been on your system for quite some time. Do you mind taking a coffee, or would you like to take some break, and so on. So real-time communication is something that we are really, really looking at, and then measuring what the real impact of that messaging is.
And were these brought in as a sort of generalized view across the operators in your sector, or is it you guys have gone with these because you've seen them elsewhere? Where did the actual implementation of these come from?
So I have seen other operators doing this in the sector. Of course, I've seen like Kindred. I've also kind of seen Necton's implementation, or I've heard about Necton's implementation with other operators. So I've been reading all these researches which are being published. So definitely I've seen that, some of these things have proven to be useful, but definitely it's a learning phase for us as well, because we've never used an analytics we used basic analytics, which we received from our data intelligence team, but a system which provides real-time intelligence and real-time communication is something new for us. So definitely we would like to see how it gets implemented, and moreover how it is taken or perceived by the players, because that's the most important part. Like as everybody mentioned, we don't want to really drive players to a illegal gambling market. We definitely want them to be with us, and we are looking for a long-term relationship with our customers. So we also are waiting to see what the customers' feedback would be.
No, I think look, I think the industry gets a lot of criticism. Sometimes it's reasonable, sometimes it isn't. But I certainly think over the last couple of years, that whole landscape around how we view customer protection has changed. And not everybody will do it, but ultimately regulators and people like yourselves and how they pull together, the answers are in there somewhere, just we need to research it more and obviously collaborate more. I think just quickly on the Germany front, because we won't have time to go through everyone, but the Germans, for anyone that's not au fait with the Germans, they're going for wagering limits across all verticals. So I think theirs is €1,000, but that's across every angle. So there's some technology challenges around there. If you want to, they'll have maximum bet limits, maximum 20. You can only lose 20% of your maximum spend. Extra EDD. There's limits on 1% of operators' total customers, and then there's obviously the stuff we hear about, which is bonus bets being removed and €1 spins for slots. Let's come to Peter Paul on this one first. Have you seen, from specific measurable KPIs like those, have you seen ones that work, the ones that we should be avoiding? Is there any ones you'd like to bring up in the discussion?
Well, in general, responding to the changes in Germany, you have to start with a compliment. So Germany finally got there, and they're regulating the online gambling market, which is great. They're even beating the Netherlands in it. So take my hat off to them. But then, more specifically to some of the KPIs that they have introduced, they seem arbitrary. They don't seem to be based on any factual information. The motivation seems to be lacking from the regulations as well. And what is even more worrying is that Germany does not have a channeling target. So they're basically aiming. Well, they're not even taking aim. So they're not having a target of, say, 95% channeling to the regulated offer. And the only thing that this seems to be doing is protecting the position of the already operating incumbents in Germany. And I think it's worrisome, and I think it's going to be hard to get this market functional when it opens, and we're already into the transitional period that started on the 15th of October. So it will be interesting to see how many of the consumers will the operators manage to hold on to until July 1st, when the market really opens and they can offer, the games that are licensed. But it is worrisome, to be honest.
I think it's the channelization aspect, which for those that aren't au fait with this, is how much of the industry is regulated and how much goes offshore. Is key, because that shows, I think, where regulators are maybe getting it right. And as for your comment on Germany, I don't want to make this about Germany, but they are only in transition. I'm still trying to get through till next year and keep everybody on board. And that's going to be some of the key things. I think there's been other marketplaces where it's not been attractive or friction-free to get in, and they've not gone particularly well. And that ultimately comes down to how the players are protected. Matthew, just on the grey market question there, I'm assuming that, again, similar sort of thing, does it matter for the people who deal with is where somebody's regulated, or if it's meaningful and attractive regulation, or is it just, as you mentioned earlier, they'll just take a bet wherever they can get it?
For the majority, it does matter, yes.
Yeah.
I'll keep coming back to that because, the mass market, it really does matter. But for those outside of that, those that have got high levels of addiction, then they will take a bet wherever they can get it.
Yeah. Okay, and I think that's it. I think the industry's been, we need to judge by what we can do for the majority. I think, Yannick, I'll come to you just on a couple of those German points there around limits on, say, spins and slots, and people trying to increase their deposit limits. What have you found from the Malta perspective, and your views on putting limits on those?
Well, we don't impose specific limits on spins or any time limits of the sort. We have a model that is based on voluntary limits. So players are offered the possibility to set deposit limits. They must set deposit limits or wager limits, either or. And they also have to set time limits in the sense of how long they spend playing a game or playing a particular slot game or any game for that matter. But we do not follow the same model. So our way of achieving our objective of safer gambling is based at the moment on voluntary limits. Okay,
well, that's fair enough. Look, I'm going to come to a couple of points. For those who are on the panel, I can, for some reason, no longer see any questions that are on there or the chat room. So if there are any questions, feel free to shout up and read them out. But that's disappeared from mine. So I think what I'll do for the remaining couple of minutes is we've had a couple of conversations on the panel around what would be specific and relevant KPIs to look at. And I'll just go through a couple of them. And I think, customer visits to irresponsible gambling or consumer protection pages, how people have viewed their activity statements and account summaries, how many customers are detected at exhibiting risky sort of potential gambling problems, how we contact them is a very specific one, and whether that's very personal or impersonal, sort of phone call versus email. And how many customers enact all the consumer protection tools. I think if there's a bunch of tools on there and people are engaging with them, then that's probably a good sign of it. Timeout, self-exclusion, clearly, and I think those are a list of some of them. Can I just ask, Sally, and we'll make this sort of the last round of questions, is there a defined sort of research perspective on what is risky play or potential problem gambling? Is there anything you've seen from a research perspective on that?
Yes, so we have defined a couple of key risk indicators. It is important to note that we can't definitively identify someone as having a gambling problem because it is very context and individual dependent. But there are risk markers, and again, the research has only been conducted on a handful of websites that have agreed to share their customer data. So I do encourage that wagering or online gambling operators more broadly do share their data for research purposes so we can get a better indication. But some of the risk indicators include the frequency of deposits, the ratio of deposits and withdrawals, combination of events. So typically we will have risk indicators such as potentially high frequency, high intensity betting, high variety of betting, that is, so betting on a lot of different events, a lot of volatility, so doesn't look planned and systematized. It looks relatively impulsive and chaotic in some sense, which might be an indicator of chasing losses or unplanned. Now, none of these risk indicators in isolation might indicate a gambling problem, where we start to see them in series, so together, combined with other things which again might not in themselves be problematic, but for example, gambling between midnight and 6 a.m., high intensity of gambling, these sorts of things together build up a profile that look at risk indicators. And that's why the contact is quite important. So we can do an assessment of, is there a reason, is there some kind of rational explanation, or does that person likely have a risk and would benefit from something like a deposit limit or a timeout?
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. I think I'll sort of make the last point. We're coming to the end at this point. By the way, if anybody can see questions, shout up. But the last point for me, Matthew, thanks. I'll share. You sent us some information on the data you've provided or your last research, and I'll share that with those that have attended the webinar today when we do the recording. But one of the points we picked up around sort of KPIs and how we're judging them is the international nature of what we do. So one of the fascinating topics I think we briefly touched on last time is for those that are coming through to gambling therapy, and certainly at Gordon Moody's, it's very much a global picture. Can you quickly give us a view of some of that research, and especially say the likes of the Brazil, which we discussed? Do you want to give us a view of that?
Yeah, so within Gordon Moody, we also deliver Gambling Therapy, which is our online international tool for helping those with their gambling addictions. What's really interesting is that our number one market at the moment in terms of connections and contacts is coming from Brazil, which really surprises us because it isn't a large market in itself. It's then followed quickly behind by the US and Canada, and then into Europe. Countries like Germany, for example, there are a very small number of people reaching out to us. There are a number of reasons why that happens. One, awareness, and two, the depth of addiction in that area as well. But we find it really interesting that for a country where we've done no advertising, no promotion, no real push on the service, that we get the vast majority of our connections coming from a country like Brazil. It's really interesting for us.
Do you think it's got anything to do with meaningful regulation? I mean, you mentioned, obviously, the far end of that doesn't really matter, but a number of those countries are not heavily regulated and haven't got sort of the protection measures that might be in there. Do you think that's got anything to do with it?
I think that's one thing to do with it. I think the development of treatment services in those countries as well, and what exists or what doesn't exist, has something to do with it as well. You know, the treatment service market in the UK is very well developed, but we still get a large proportion of people calling us from the UK when there are other services available. So, you know, a very well regulated market like the UK or elsewhere, we will still see a good volume of calls into gambling therapy. Okay.
All right, good stuff. So last point, before we get to that, I will follow up to all those who have attended with obviously a recording of this, but also some of the information from sort of Sally's research, and if you're all right with that, Matthew, some of that, the latest figures you've just sent over to us all. But when it comes, I think let's finish off with a conversation around KPIs, the importance of them, and whether we feel the industry needs to maybe step up further than what we've done. And I think I'll start with the operator's view on this, because Sanjay, you seem to be doing quite a lot on this. What's your final thoughts on KPIs in general?
I think KPIs are good and they should be there because anything which has to be measured, that can only give a clear indication. But I would say there have to be primary KPIs and secondary KPIs. Right, like for example, a generic KPI, like how many people have touched the RG gaming page and so on, and specific KPIs in terms of how many self-exclusions, how many people reduce their deposit limits and so on. So I think we can definitely look at it from a primary, which are like the most key indicators for the 1 or 2% of population who are really are the problem gamblers, and the secondary KPIs for the general mass population.
Okay. All right, Peter, Paul, yourself?
Yeah, I completely agree. KPIs are key for good service and good understanding of the market. So, in the Netherlands, just for your information, I think I already told the audience on last webinar that we will be stepping up to the plate, and we will be basically sticking the thermometer into the Dutch online gambling market to actually see how gambling operators are performing. And we will be reporting on those figures, so on those KPIs as well. So as we say in Dutch, measuring is knowing. So yes, definitely.
Good stuff. Janneke, from a regulator's perspective. Oh, you're on mute, I think, Janneke.
Oh, yes, sorry about that.
We've gone this far without a hiccup. That's great. Don't worry about it.
I'm sorry. I had to break the record. We will be issuing more specific guidelines also with regards to what we are expecting, more specifically out of operators in the field of RG, and We will be doing that in the very near future, and we will be basing this off research which we have commissioned in the area. It will be published very, very soon.
Right. Matthew, from your side, I think probably reiterates the points you've made as we go through this. Is it the fact that for the majority, these are going to be useful?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, having that regulation in place and having those boundaries in place would be very useful. Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Great stuff. I'll leave the last word. I think I've covered everybody to Sally. And obviously this is your area of research. I think, is this an area going to be much more of a focus from, say, your perspective and the likes of Mark in the UK? Do you think KPIs are an area to focus on?
Absolutely, and I think it's great to have been part of this conversation. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope that it's been very interesting for those listening. Certainly, collaboration, I think, is vital, and working with researchers. Obviously, I'm relatively biased in that, but I do think that's quite fundamental, and it's been very telling that so many different regulators and government organisations and operators from around the world have come to myself and other researchers to get better metrics, to really understand what's going on. Because although internet gambling has been around for quite some time, consumer protection has only recently risen to quite the level of attention and requirement that it has. So we're still very much playing catch up and don't have a great understanding of what the best ways to promote responsible gambling and consumer protection tools, and we do need to refine these so we can make it as useful as possible for the consumers, so that these consumer protection tools are really serving their purpose in allowing people to enjoy their gambling while minimising the risks.
Yeah, good stuff. And bear in mind, I work for a technology company. I found the questions. I found them too late. So what I'll do is, as a follow-up for everybody who's on here, I'll take those questions, put them into a format, get the panel's input, and get those out to everybody, along with the list of specific KPIs we've been discussing, whether it be Germany or Belgium or the ones we've discussed individually. But for now, I'd like to thank the panelists specifically, and obviously for everybody tuning in on the morning, especially for Sally being late at night in Australia. But for everybody else, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day. Look forward to speaking to you all soon.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.